Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Skeptics in the Pub Online, your regular dose of skeptical inquiry, critical thinking, and interesting talks, all from the comfort of your very own home. I'm your host for this evening. I'm Michael Marshall. I'm the editor of The Skeptic magazine here in the UK, and I'm really interested, I'm really excited for the conversation that we're going to be having this evening. So we're going to be having a conversation with our guest speaker all about a fascinating topic that I'll tell you all about in just a moment. But if this is your first ever Skeptics in the Pub Online, welcome along. I hope you enjoy it. We've been doing these events on a regular basis all the way throughout the pandemic. This is an organization and a group made up of all different members of different Skeptics in the Pub groups from around the UK who come together and collaborate to put these events on. So if you do enjoy this, if this is your first time, or even if you've seen a couple of our broadcasts and you enjoy them, by all means, have a look for your local group, because all the Skeptics in the Pub groups across the UK are back in the pub, where you can have all of this, but with actual people's faces in front of you and nearby, and it's a lot of fun. So I'm one of the organisers of the Liverpool group. So if you're watching from Liverpool, come along to our events. If you aren't near a local group, or if you just like to sit back at home and take in your skepticism from your couch. Next month we have a speaker, Stephen Colgan, who's one of the writers who used to be one of the writers for QI. He used to be a police officer, and he's going to be talking all about asking the question: do we need a new witchcraft? Because what he's going to be talking about is essentially a woo-free look at the various different bits of health advice that historically would have been ascribed to witchcraft, but have actually turned out to be pretty well versed and well based in evidence. So that'll be really interesting. You can see that right here on twitch.tv/SITP in 1 month's time. Meanwhile, while you're here, feel free to make yourself at home, relax, have a chat. Unlike in person, we don't get irritated if you talk to one another during. We actively encourage it. So you're there in the chat, you can say hi to everybody. But be nice, be friendly, be respectful. If you do see something in the chat that you don't think should be there, be sure to let one of the moderators know. And the moderators, you can see, have got a little sword next to their name, and they can sort stuff out. As I say, this is going to be a conversation. So normally what we do is we'd have a talk in the first half and your questions in the second half. I'm actually going to be asking questions throughout. So if you do have questions for tonight's speaker, at any point, go to sitp.online/ask, where you can ask your question there. And I'll be able to put your questions to the speaker this evening. You can also see other people's questions and upvote the ones that you think are pretty good, pretty interesting. You can't downvote ones, but the ones that are really good will filter to the top, and I'll make sure they get answered. Also, if you really enjoy what we're doing and you want to support it, you can go to sitp.online/donate to throw a couple of pound in the coffers to keep the lights on and that kind of thing. I think that's all the announcements that I have to give you at the start here. So let's get on with what you're here for tonight. So our speaker this evening is Mike Rothschild. He's a journalist, an author, and an expert on conspiracy theories. He's given testimony to Congress on the subject of the threat of election disinformation. He's appeared in interviews for CNN, NPR, the New York Times. His previous book, which he actually gave a talk for us previously on, was called The Storm Is Upon Us. And it was essentially the definitive book on the QAnon movement and how it grew into what it became. And he gave a fantastic talk for us last time around. He has a new book out, Jewish Space Lasers, which was out last month, which is all about the 2 centuries of conspiracy theories that have surrounded the famous family that happens to share his surname. So please, everyone, welcome back to Skeptics in the Pub Online. Your speaker for this evening, Mike Rothschild. Everybody, I'm sure, is throwing clapping emojis and other such celebratory things in the chat. Mike, welcome back to Skeptics in the Pub Online. It's great to have you back.
It's great to be back. This was so much fun last time. I'm really excited.
Well, I'm very excited because I read the book. I thought it was absolutely fascinating and a really in-depth kind of look at how we got to this place where the Rothschild name is so synonymous, for negative reasons, with conspiracy theory, for work not of their own doing. So I guess if we're to talk about that, my opening question really is, why this book and why now at this point in history?
Well, I've having the last name Rothschild and debunking conspiracy theories, the comments really started pretty much right away. A Rothschild debunking conspiracy theories. How stupid do they think we are? The Matrix must be broken. Unplug the simulation. But this name has been fodder for myths, tropes, hoaxes, conspiracy theories, outright hate for 2 centuries now. And I really wanted to know why this name? Why is it this name over and over? There are a lot of historically wealthy Jewish families. There are the Guggenheims, there are the Sassoons, there are many, many others. Why this name? And of course, my connection to it is part of it, but it's also just anything that has this many myths around it. There's going to be a truth to it that is probably a lot more interesting than the myths. And in diving into that, I found a lot of really interesting history, really interesting cultural nuggets that are not talked about very much because we spend so much time on they own all the central banks and fund both sides of every war and have $500 trillion. That's not that interesting to me. The really interesting stuff is the actual history that I really spend a lot of time talking about in the book.
Yeah. Well, I think I definitely want to get to that. But I think before we look at the Rothschilds in particular, I want to start a little bit broader than that to ask, why is it Jews that get targeted? Why is it Jewish people throughout history that have been targeted by society for these myths around, domination of politics and finance and these shady figures behind conspiracy theories? Why Jews?
So the myth of Jews and money is actually a lot older than the myth of Jews using that money to control everything. That really happens at the beginning of the 20th century. But for many, many centuries before that, going well back into maybe the 11 or 1200s, Jews were linked with money because Jewish communities had access to wealth that they were able to lend at interest. And Catholic canon law essentially made usury, which was lending money at too high an interest rate, essentially a crime that was equal to heresy or murder. It was one of the worst things that you can do. At the same time, these communities needed money. These rulers, these princes, these kings, the Pope needed money to build their giant churches, to equip their armies, to build their palaces. So when they needed that money, they went to the Jewish community. And in fact, a lot of European royalty had what was called a court banker or a court Jew on their staff, essentially, a Jewish member of their entourage who was able to go to the Jewish community and borrow this money for their ruler. So you had this linking between Jews and wealth. Jews they had access to it, they knew how to get it, but they were also too wealthy. They had too much money, they had too much power. So you had this sort of very strange dichotomy where Jewish communities had wealth that the ruler or the church needed, but they also had too much of it. And they were able to lend it at interest, but sometimes that interest rate was too high. And whoever made those rules of what was too much, what was too high, essentially had the Jewish community at their beck and call. And it went bad for a lot of these court Jews many times in history. Now, the idea of Jews kind of using that wealth for world domination, that really starts in the 20th century with the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Yeah. And of course, this is the Russian document that first appeared in Russia in 1903, was translated into English and into German, into Arabic, into many, many other languages in the 1920s. And it posited that there was this group of the Elders of Zion who were plotting in secret to dominate the world and impose their will on Christendom. Of course, almost as soon as the protocols were translated, it was revealed as a hoax. But for many of the believers in the protocols, the fact that they weren't real didn't really matter because the ideas in them, those we know are real. So again, you have that dichotomy of we're basing this entire conspiracy theory off this document we know is fake, but it doesn't matter that it's fake because we want to believe the conspiracy is real.
Yeah. And I guess at that time when the aristocracy, the royalty were borrowing money from Jewish people, I guess that kind of would have simmered a level of resentment that these people who are these societies that are and cultures that are othered in the mainstream society because of their religion and the race and things like that, and seen as outsiders, still holding the purse strings because they have the money. So how much of it comes from that resentment that would have built up, do you think? I think that's something you touch on a little in the book.
Yeah, there was a lot of resentment. There was a lot of suspicion. The Jewish communities of the Middle Ages were very much an outgroup. They dressed differently. They had different customs. They wore their hair differently, different dietary laws. So automatically they were placed outside of sort of mainstream Christian society. And they had this money that the community really needed and that they often shared with other people in their community, other co-religionists. So there was an element of suspicion, there was an element of distrust, there was definitely resentment. And you could see that when a ruler died, their court Jew was almost always regarded with suspicion. And of course, the most famous one of these was Joseph Suss Oppenheimer, who was the court Jew to the Duke of Württemberg, I guess I should pronounce it in the German way. When his patron died, Suss was essentially accused of all sorts of sexual crimes and impropriety, and he was tried. He was immediately found guilty, and he was tortured to death. So, and of course, this story would be used again and again as anti-Jewish propaganda, an example of the depravity of Jewish wealth and why these people could never be trusted, despite the fact that a lot of these communities really relied on their wealth.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess so we have in that set of circumstances we have the Rothschilds families coming up and coming into wealth. So for people who only know the name Rothschild, well, from your book and from your work, obviously, but also from the conspiracy theories around the more famous family, they may not know the actual story of the Rothschilds. So who were they, and how did they become this incredibly wealthy target, essentially?
Sure. So Mayer Amschel Rothschild was the sort of the patriarch of the modern iteration of the Rothschild family. And he had actually been a rabbinical student until both of his parents died. I think it was smallpox, and he had to move back to Frankfurt. He, along with about 3,000 other Jews, lived in the Jewish ghetto, the Judengasse, the Jews' lane. It was this tiny little cramped in community that was basically a ghetto. And in that community, you had a number of very small time merchants. You had textile dealers, you had money changers, because all of the states of the Holy Roman Empire used different currency. Somebody had to switch out one currency for another and they would take a fee. Well, they did it. So you had a number of small-time Jewish bankers who did this, and Mayer worked his way up to becoming the court Jew to the Crown Prince of Hesse. This was one of the states of the Holy Roman Empire, and as such, he was able to travel all around what would now be called Germany. He was able to build a number of connections in his business. His first son, Amschel, joined his business, and by the time the late 1700s came and the Napoleonic Wars started, Mayer had essentially positioned himself as one of the more powerful German Jewish bankers in this area. As such, he was able to get access to the fortune of the Elector of Hesse. Now, the Elector was one of the figures who elected the Holy Roman Emperor. And of course, this is at the very tail end of the Holy Roman Empire. It would fall apart in the early 1800s. But the Elector of Hesse had an enormous amount of money, much of which he made through the lending of mercenaries. The Hessians that are mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, the foreign mercenaries who fought on the British side. So he had a huge amount of money that he needed to hide from Napoleon's forces. He enlisted Mayer and Amschel to do this, and they came up with this system to essentially move this money around from Europe to England and back to essentially fund the effort against Napoleon. So this culminates in the Battle of Waterloo. The Rothschilds have been funding the forces of Wellington. And of course, that turns into one of the great Rothschild myths, was the myth that Nathan Rothschild, who was the third son of Mayer, had advanced knowledge of the outcome of the battle, used that to make enough money to take control of the British Empire. But it starts with the money from the old man, as they call him, the Elector of Hesse, that the Rothschilds are able to essentially turn into this great family fortune.
Mm. And that story of Nathan and Waterloo, in the book, that's a really fascinating thing to read through, not just because of the way in which it's been built into this myth, but also the many variants of it that seem to just change interchangeably depending on who's telling the story. There's carrier pigeons, there's threatened
Yes.
sailors, there's big storms. So could you tell us a
Yeah.
little bit about that story, but also the work that you did to try and figure out what actually happened and which parts of it were just kind of fabrication and embellishment?
Yeah, so there is the sort of foundational myth about the Rothschilds. And this myth doesn't really emerge until about 30 years after the Battle of Waterloo. And that it was Nathan Rothschild was there. He wasn't just, helping to fund Wellington's forces. He was actually at the battle and he watched it happening. Some accounts say he was so close he could smell the cannon smoke and, see the anguish on the faces of the wounded soldiers. And seeing that Napoleon was losing the battle, He got on his steed, he rode across Belgium in the middle of the night, got to the channel port of Ostend, bribed a terrified sailor to take him across the English Channel during a once-in-a-century storm. These are all details that are found in various biographies of the family, going from about the mid 1800s to the late 1900s. Really, these sort of absolutely ridiculously cinematic details. According to some of the original stories, Nathan gets to the London Stock Exchange. He's exhausted. He's unkempt. He slumps against his favorite pillar at the exchange. The other bankers see how exhausted and defeated he looks. They assume that it means Napoleon has won the battle. They start selling their stocks. Meanwhile, of course, Nathan knows what's happened, and he's secretly motioning his agents to buy up all the sold stocks at depressed prices. Then the news of the actual outcome of Napoleon's defeat comes in. Those stocks skyrocket in value, and Nathan immediately becomes the richest man in the British Empire.
Yeah.
Now, none of that happened. That is an entirely post hoc fabrication. We know now that we don't know exactly how much money Nathan made off the battle, but it was very little. Because of just sort of how the calendar would have worked and who actually brought the news over. There's been a lot of scholarship in the last decade or so sort of unpacking how all of this happened. And it's a very complicated story. There's a guy who was basically vacationing in Belgium who got the news and was able to get a newspaper over. Nathan probably was among the first to get the news, but he was not the first, and he didn't do anything with the news because by the time he got the news, the London Stock Exchange had already opened. So there are very historical things at play here, but there's also a myth that would be sort of repurposed and reimagined. There's later iterations of it that Nathan wasn't at the battle, but he had a courier named Rothworth who was at the battle. There's a 1934 Hollywood film of the sort of Nathan getting the news of Waterloo, and there's a Nazi version of that film, and Rothworth is in both those films. And in one, he's kind of an eager young go-getter. In the Nazi version, he's like a hapless drunk. I mean, there's all these different versions of this story. But at the core of it, it's just that the Rothschilds made a huge amount of money off the Napoleonic Wars, because they were lending gold, they were selling bonds, they were equipping these armies, and they were taking a percentage of everything. But this idea that in sort of one swift stroke, Nathan took control of the British Empire is just completely ridiculous.
Yeah, and reading in the book, it's fascinating how they're talking about how they embellished the amount that he made, that he bought the bank, that he bought out Britain. I also love the idea that his plan was to get all the way over from Belgium across these various different planes, trains, and automobiles of his day, and then to just rely entirely on his acting chops to be able to pull off in the room.
He doesn't even announce anything. Like, he just goes in there and just slumps over, and just everyone knows. He doesn't have to say anything. It's like a classic conspiracy theory in that it relies on all of these things going exactly right, when we know that things like that never go exactly right.
Yeah. But one thing you mentioned in there about how they really made their money by funding some of the wars and funding the efforts against Napoleon. This sort of comes down in a way to that idea that lots of lies and even some conspiracy theories are based on ideas that have got a kernel of truth that's been sort of distorted and twisted into something kind of grotesque. So the idea that the Rothschild family at this point were funding a side of the war, and I think you even write about there were some later wars that they actually ended up funding both sides on that war, but not through nefarious
they would have during the Franco-Prussian War, they had interests. There was a Rothschild house in France, in Paris. They had an enormous investment in Prussia. Because they were so wealthy and because they had invested so much and in so many different nations, it was sort of inevitable that their interests would be pitted against each other. But it wasn't just a nefarious plan. It was the constant warring in Europe at the time.
Yeah, everyone was at each other's throats, and they happened to be the places where the money lived. Yeah,
right, exactly.
So you mentioned that this Nathan story, the Waterloo story, which is kind of one of the foundational myths of the Rothschilds, that didn't really emerge until 30 or 40 or however many years after. Where did those stories start to emerge from, and what were the kind of forces that were driving these these twisted interpretations.
Sure. So that Waterloo story really emerges in about 1846, and that is 30 years after the battle. That's 10 years after Nathan's died, so he can't dispute the story.
Hmm.
And these stories start to come out in the sort of socialist fervor of late 1840s Paris. This was the lead up to the revolutions of 1848, where you had these socialist revolutions all across Europe, many of which fizzled out. But there was a great deal of anti-wealth sentiment, and anti-wealth sentiment and anti-Semitism are completely bound up in each other. And a lot of this was directed at the Rothschilds simply because they were so visible. They had their palaces, they had their artworks, their name was on a lot of things. People knew who they were. So in 1846, you have a pamphlet that appears written under the pen name of Satan, called The Curious and Edifying History of James I, King of the Jews. And this is James de Rothschild, another one of Mayer's sons, who was based in Paris at this point, and after Nathan's death, sort of became the head of the family. And James had really set his sights on expanding the railroads, really on linking all of Europe together through his railroads. And some of these names are still well known in France. The Nord Line was established by James de Rothschild. And a few months before this pamphlet comes out, there was a crash on one of the Nord Line trains, and it's in this little town called Fampoux. It's north of Paris, and something like between 15 to 20 people die. I mean, it's certainly terrible. The press at the time writes about it in all of these horribly graphic and lurid details. But it was not the worst train crash in French history. There were other crashes that were worse, except this one was linked to the Rothschilds. So this pamphlet comes out and it makes these two accusations. The one is the Waterloo myth. The other is that James had built these railroads that were cheap, they were shoddy. He didn't care about the life of ordinary Frenchmen. He only wanted to make money. He wouldn't even stop the trains running after the crash. It makes all of these accusations. And so these two myths put together really show the Rothschilds as sort of greedy and also as these string pullers. And it really kind of cements the dual myth of the Rothschilds, that they are incredibly greedy and incredibly powerful. So this pamphlet kicks off this pamphlet war in Paris. There are response pamphlets that are pro-Rothschild. There are responses to the responses that are anti-Rothschild. There are pamphlets in other parts of Europe. And of course, this gets tied up with a blood libel panic that's going on at the time called the Damascus Affair, which is a real incident where a Capuchin friar in Damascus and his Muslim helper disappear. And the rumor is that they were kidnapped and ritually murdered in a blood libel by the local Jews. And the Rothschilds get dragged into that. They help try to diffuse it. So you have this spike of anti-Semitism based around the Damascus affair. You have this spike in anti-wealth sentiment that's going on just in general with the growing socialist movements. And it sparks a powder keg that explodes with the Rothschilds essentially as the victims.
Mm-hmm. And so if we move sort of forward in time, we can get into the 20th century. You've already touched on the protocols and not just their emergence from Russian propaganda, but obviously this was picked up quite heavily by Henry Ford and spread around America. So is this where we start to see myths around the Rothschilds starting to come to America? Because I understand they weren't really they weren't really related to America, or weren't really involved with America too much by that point.
Right. The Rothschilds never emigrated to the United States. They felt it was too much of a backwater. They didn't understand the differences between federal law and state law. They just didn't grasp the opportunity that was in the United States. So Rothschild myths really came with the Jewish diaspora. So you had people fleeing Eastern Europe who carried the name Rothschild with them as this beacon of wealth and hope and aspiration. And of course, those myths really start to get going in the US around the Civil War, because the Rothschilds' chief agent in New York, a sort of Americanized German Jew named August Belmont, was a Democrat. And of course, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. And so there were all of these op-eds and stories in Union papers of the Rothschilds control the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party controls George McClellan, who was Lincoln's electoral opponent in 1864. So you have this very uncomfortable linking of the Rothschilds and the Confederacy. Now, the Rothschilds never funded the Confederacy. They didn't get involved in the Civil War at all. But this idea that the Rothschilds were manipulating this, they were funding the South, they were funding both sides, they were trying to divide the country. They were going to give the North to Canada, the South to France. I mean, all of this ridiculousness really starts to show up in conspiracy theories in the beginning of the 20th century. So you have this idea that the Rothschilds were manipulating US political affairs, which really takes off in the time between the two wars, which of course is this hideously anti-Semitic time when isolationism and the America First movement really, really springs up, and they want to keep America out of what's seen as another Jewish war in Europe. So all of these things mixed together, and they again are using the Rothschilds as a focal point, because by this point there's an industry of myths about the family. We're now 80 years from the Satan pamphlet, and now these conspiracy theories have become so prevalent that essentially people just like now know the name Rothschild because of the myths, not because of anything the family did, but because of what people have said the family did.
And to what degree do you think the name became not just a useful focal point for anti-Jewish sentiment, but also kind of a cover for those who wanted to express anti-Jewish sentiment without it seeming against Jews in particular, Jews in general? So it's the idea of, I'm not against Jews, I'm against these people who are doing this particular thing, but what you're saying is anti-Semitic tropes.
Absolutely. And it became very clear that the Rothschilds were a very convenient target for people who were extremely anti-Semitic but did not want to seem like they were extremely anti-Semitic. You could blame Jewish wealth, Jewish bankers, London financiers, the insiders, the hidden hand, whatever name you want to give them. Of course, we're seeing that even now, with groups like the New World Order and the Illuminati, the Trilateral Commission. When people sort of throw those terms around, what they mean are wealthy Jewish families who are controlling things, and the Rothschilds are seen as essentially the controllers of the controllers.
Yeah, and what I found particularly galling reading about it was that these kind of myths continued through the war. About the Rothschilds are funding the war. The Rothschilds are sitting in a lap of luxury, watching the decimation of Europe at a time when actually the Rothschilds were huge victims of what was going on in Germany and Austria and the places at the time.
Yeah, you have a lot of pro-fascist writing during the war, conspiracy theorist writing immediately after the war, that claims that the Rothschilds are orchestrating all of this, that they're helping fund Hitler, that they're, what I think is Gary Allen and None Dare Call It Conspiracy in the 70s talks about the Rothschilds and the Warburgs, sitting in their luxury Paris hotels, watching all of the carnage. In reality, the Rothschilds were on the run the way every other Jew was. Many of them had to escape with their lives. They took basically what they could carry with them. Several members of the extended Rothschild family did die during the Holocaust. The Austrian branch of the Rothschild family was essentially destroyed. It was never rebuilt. Their palaces were looted. Their artworks were stolen. I mean, it's certainly, it's sort of, as we call it now, first world problems, like, oh, my 5 palaces were looted by the Nazis. But it took the family a long time to get a lot of this property back, and some of it they never got back.
Yeah. I mean, I do have to confess, reading that part of the book, seeing the way that property was stolen and things was obviously awful. There was a part of me that when I read the line about how they lost an area of land the size of Manhattan, there was a small part of me that thought no one should own an area of land the size of Manhattan.
I get it. Yeah.
But that's not excusing anything that went on, of course. It was just a moment there. Talking about the other part that I found really fascinating about the way in which the Nazis overtly took on the anti-Semitic tropes that were emerging from America. They used the protocols and sort of made a conscious choice to make films that were explicitly anti-Semitic. I thought that was really interesting, and also the use of the protocols. There was something you wrote that I'd never heard before, but I thought was really, really fascinating, was that they started to pump out anti-Semitic propaganda in Arabic in order to drive anti-Semitism in Muslim populations too.
Yeah, the Nazis absolutely exploited the Rothschild myth as part of their propaganda. We see it really bloom in 1940 with this series of films that are released. But even in the earliest Nazi writing. You have stuff from the very beginning of the Nazi Party, 1919, 1920, talking about the Rothschilds are going to own German wealth if we don't do something about it. Hitler would reference the Rothschilds in speeches. I think it was 1935, the degenerate art exhibit by Goebbels, The Eternal Jew, has these forged letters from Mayor Amschel Rothschild purporting to send his sons out to the financial capitals of Europe. And then in 1938, you have Kristallnacht. And we talk about how it was a turning point for the Jews of Germany and Austria, but the Nazi regime, particularly the propaganda ministry, was actually quite disappointed in the apathetic response of the German people. They really felt like the German people would rise as one and expel all of the Jews from their community. A lot of Germans just didn't care one way or another, and so the Goebbels and Hitler and the people around them really decided we really need to use film to kick this up a notch, to move people from just sort of suspicion and othering to the first stirrings of what would become outright extermination. And that's where these films like The Eternal Jew, the Rothschilds shares in Waterloo, another version of the Joseph Suss Oppenheimer story, these were designed to move the German people from we don't trust the Jews to we have to get rid of the Jews. And you can really see that in some of the documentation of the time, that when Hitler saw footage from The Eternal Jew, these staged ritual slaughters being done in the ghettos of Poland, which had just been conquered, Hitler was appalled. And that really starts to move the Nazi bureaucracy towards the final solution.
Yeah, and that I thought was interesting, that it's the staged stuff that is kind of that was eliciting that disgust, because we sort of see echoes of that into modern conspiracy movements. The idea of in QAnon and things, the blood libel stuff in there.
Sure.
It's not the stuff that's actually happening. It's what you've imagined and you've told each other is happening, and that's the stuff that kind of redrives the fear and the disgust. If we move a little bit closer, I recognize I want to get through a bit more. So let's bring it a bit more up to date. We can look at the way in which these kind of myths then started to spread around, the nascent internet, forums, newsletters. It seems at this point that became the crystallizing point of the idea of Jewish control, of these families' control over everything. How much of that early internet kind of forum culture was driving and cementing these myths, do you think?
Yeah, it's a huge part of it. And conspiracy theorists are really, really good at adopting new technology. You go all the way back to the printing press, or the duplication of color photos, or early home video technology. The internet was really a boon to these people. And you can see, as early as mid-1994, Usenet forums like alt.conspiracy are already huge. They've got hundreds of thousands of posts. This is a time when most people don't even have an email address. And you've got very, very vibrant conspiracy communities online. And of course, what are they doing? They're going after the Rothschilds. So you see the repurposing of some of these 70s and 80s myths about the Rothschilds that find a very ready home on early Usenet groups, Yahoo groups, message boards, places like that. A lot of this stuff is gone. There very, very little of that earliest vestige of the internet remains. But what you can find is full of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories.
Yeah. And it seems like this is where we started to see, and maybe we've seen it throughout history, but we certainly see it here. That idea of the research that you're doing is sort of taking anything at face value that supports what you believe in, and it doesn't matter how unsourced it was. It doesn't matter if there really wasn't a midnight dash by Nathan. It doesn't really matter if there wasn't a thing on the deathbed sending out your sons to conquer Europe. But if it agrees with you, take it on board. And that seems to be the thread that holds a lot of conspiracy theory together, really, is this idea of like, well, I'm doing my research, which means I've found something I agree with, and I just bring it wholesale into the worldview that I'm putting together.
Right. It's I want to believe it, and it sounds like it could be true. Therefore, it's true. And I don't care whether or not it's actually true. In fact, looking into whether it's actually true or not will disabuse me of some of these notions. So I'm not going to do that. And you find that just over and over and over again with these memes and these conspiracies and these accusations against the Rothschilds. They're ridiculous. The idea that the Rothschilds have $500 trillion in wealth is ludicrous. No person who is like a high functioning human being should believe that that's true, but many people do. You can find this on Twitter, on r/conspiracy right now, and it's ludicrous. It's insane.
Yeah, and am I right in thinking that that claim used to be 500 billion, but they've added a few noughts to it because it's...
That's as one of the things I wanted to track down was that specific number. There is a book from 1940 called Rothschild Money Trust, very obscure for a reason, that makes the claim that the Rothschilds had $500 billion in 1940. So at some point, somebody just turned that into trillion because, hey, what's more sinister than $1 billion? Oh, $1 trillion.
Yeah, yeah. So I think we kind of pieced together the history of it here. What I think is what I wanted to sort of touch on for the remainder of this part of the conversation before we go for a break is the tropes in conspiracism that are anti-Semitic. Are there tropes in modern conspiracism that people wouldn't realize were anti-Semitic? Are things that are vestiges of anti-Semitism, but actually most people, when they look at it, they'd say, well, in this case, you're talking about the Rothschilds. You're not talking about Jewish people in general. Are there other tropes like that people should be on the lookout for?
Sure, and I think a lot of this stuff has been excused during history because the purveyors of it have been able to say, well, I'm not talking about all Jews. I'm just talking about, the rich Jews. I'm talking about the Rothschilds. I'm talking about the Guggenheims and the Warburgs. You see a really interesting example of this in 1991 in Pat Robertson's book, The New World Order. Now, this is a New York Times bestseller. This is a huge hit. And what Robertson is doing is positing essentially that there is a conspiracy between the Rothschilds and the Freemasons and the Bavarian Illuminati to essentially merge the worlds of the occult and high finance. This is a theory that Robertson takes from the British fascist author Nesta Webster in her 1920s books. Webster, in turn, is essentially rewriting the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So, and like not even making any bones about it. Robertson couches it a little bit, but he is laundering the protocols for a huge audience. Now, what happens with this is nobody figures this out for the first couple of years. So finally, when it's revealed that Robertson was basically using the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as a secondhand source, he's like outraged that anybody would think he's anti-Semitic. He loves Jews. The Jewish people have no greater friend than him. He loves the state of Israel. And of course, the Republican Party doesn't want to piss off Pat Robertson because they need the votes of the Christian coalition. So this very earnest debate goes on in conservative Jewish journals and, sort of right-leaning press of, is Pat Robertson an anti-Semite? The fact is he laundered the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This should not be a debate at all. But I think so many people are so bad at recognizing anti-Semitism that this became something people actually had real conversations about. Oh, did he know that he was doing it? Did he really believe? Like, that is the insidious banality of anti-Semitism. It's that it worms its way into the writings of some of America's most important pundits and religious figures and politicians, and we don't know what's happening. And when we do find out it's happening, we find ways to excuse it because we just can't wrap our minds around the fact that somebody that important would feel that way about the Jewish people.
Yeah, and I guess it's that thing that the worst thing you can do in society is to call someone a racist. It's slightly worse than actually being racist.
Right, exactly.
That's the name that they keep, the term they keep away from. We had a similar thing here in England when the former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn was sharing a mural of rich bankers playing a game around a table, and there's people of color underneath holding up the table, and all we need to do is stand up. I think was one of the sort of variants on the idea. And again, it was this idea of not recognizing that as anti-Semitic, because what you're talking about is, well, these are rich old men who are in control. And are you saying there aren't rich old men in control of the world? There definitely are. And it's these kind of tropes are kind of hard to extricate.
Sure.
There's obviously a huge amount of conversation around anti-Semitism over the last, I'd say, 5 years or so. The QAnon conspiracy theory sort of brought it all back into light. Do you think there is increased awareness of anti-Semitism now, more so than decades prior, because we're better at spotting it, or because the threat to Jewish people is once again at a higher point? Are we so aware of it, do you think?
I would like to believe it's because we've gotten better at spotting it, but I don't know that we are. I mean, especially given this spasm of anti-Semitism that we're in right now, where we're seeing these classic tropes of greed and power and control and manipulation just being repurposed over and over again. I don't know that most people are better at spotting it, or maybe it's just that we've gotten more used to it, or we've sort of, there's a certain acceptability that anti-Semitism has always had in polite society. It's like, well, no one's going to look askance at you if you blame your own personal woes or the problems of the world on, the Jewish banking cabal. People are going to sort of silently agree with that, because it's still difficult for people to wrap their heads around the fact that attacking Jews as all being wealthy and powerful is anti-Semitic. Even if there are Jews that are wealthy and powerful, there are still way more people who are not Jewish who are wealthy and powerful.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing that kind of has always acted, or for a long time has acted as that cover for anti-Semitism, is this patina of irony. This idea, South Park, for example,
Sure.
would quite often have a lot of anti-Semitic jokes in there, but they would say, "Well, we're just being ironic.
Sure.
We're just joking.
It's just a joke. Don't
Yeah.
take it so seriously." Yeah, well, I mean, there's a time when it's not. And
Yeah, exactly. And then
we're kind of
that
seeing
comes all
that
the way
time,
through
right?
to Twitter and 4chan, which will
Yeah.
hide behind an ironic racism when they're actually just being
Sure.
kind of outright racist.
Yeah.
One question I did have: do you think, looking back over history, did it? Do you think it had to be Jews who ended up in this position as on the receiving end of these kind of myths, or could in another universe that myth have built up around a different race or religion of people? What did it have to be Jews?
I think given the way it all happened and some of these historical things that have been used against Jews over and over, I think it was kind of inevitable that there would be an out group in society that was very successful, that became the sort of scapegoat for all of that society's problems. And I think because of these restrictions on money lending, the Jews were going to be that wealthy group. And I think you also have the blood libel, which of course is older even than that. And then the deicide accusation, the accusation that Jews killed Jesus Christ. Because that accusation is so built into certain sects of Christianity and evangelicalism, I think it was sort of always going to be the Jews, because, there aren't ancient Romans anymore, but there are still Jews.
Yeah, and you mentioned that it's so built into Christianity and sex. It always strikes me as quite ironic, especially from an American perspective, that they're spreading these idea that there's a race and a religion who are holding all of the power and pulling the strings behind the scenes. And in a way, there is that. It's white Christian nationalism.
Right,
It's
exactly.
with the
Right.
side helping of
Yeah,
Mormonism. You can't
right.
get into power really without being of those persuasions.
Sure,
Um,
absolutely. And this is a group that doesn't make any effort to hide its wealth of power.
Um, you finished the book by talking about in some ways, the new Rothschilds, and you talk about George Soros and how the stories have kind of started to center on him. Do you think we're seeing a movement away from the Rothschilds being the focus and Soros being the focus, or are we just seeing it's all part of that same? The central group has just grown slightly, and we've added one more name to the list. Like, are we seeing that transition?
I think we've definitely seen a transition from the Rothschilds as public enemy number one to Soros as public enemy number one. Of course, a lot of conspiracies link them together. You see these cartoons that, Soros is the puppet master, but the Rothschilds are the puppet master of Soros. There's always going to be some, somebody else who's in charge, some, string puller of string pullers. But Soros makes a very convenient 21st century Rothschilds, because he's very visible, he's very politically active, he's very progressive, and sort of he hits all the marks. He's really old, he speaks in this very thick accent, he sometimes says things that are very easy to take out of context. And of course, he funds all of these causes that a lot of conspiracy theorists see as the encroachment of godless liberal progressivism. He's funding voting rights, he's funding drug legalization, prison reform, democratizing Soviet bloc nations, which you'd think the far right would be all over. And, they used to be in some ways, but that's all really changed now. So, Soros's visibility and his political persuasion really makes him very, very visible and a very inviting target.
And I guess also because, as you say, that visibility is a big key part of it, because I don't think the average person, although they know the name Rothschild, could name a single Rothschild. They
Right.
couldn't give you a first name. So I guess one question I had is like, how did the Rothschilds feel about it?
That's a good question. They did not. They were not involved in the book at all. I reached out to many of them to talk to them and kind of get their side of this. How does it feel to have these myths dragging behind you? And they just don't talk about it. And I actually did talk to their family archivist in London, and she said that they, even historically, they have not talked about any of this because they don't want to put themselves in a position to have to prove a negative.
Mm.
So they can't say, well, we don't have $500 trillion and here's the proof. There's no proof they do.
Mm.
But the people who believe this stuff don't want proof, and they would never believe a Rothschild saying it anyway. So their stance has really been to just say nothing and, just let this stuff sort of take its course. And, I've had, myths and conspiracy theories about me and false accusations. And it's very tempting to want to push back at all of these things. But after a while, there's so much of it. And these people want your attention. They want you to try to fight back. And so you basically just say, I'm just going to ignore it. I'm just going to let it go, and it's going to go away, and they're going to move on to somebody else. Now, in the case of the Rothschilds, they really haven't. But I was sort of irritated with the family for not responding to any of this at the beginning. And then by the end of it, I really understood why, because there's nothing they can really say.
Yeah, and anything you do say, any words you put out there, it's just more material for people to look for inconsistencies and misinterpretations.
Right.
We're going to take a break in a moment, but I think a nice place to end it, having talked about how they don't typically talk to people, the Rothschilds. There's an example in the book where one of the Rothschild family do give an interview, and it's not what a lot of people would expect. So perhaps you could tell us that story, because I think people would be fascinated by it.
Sure. So in 2007, I think it was, David de Rothschild is one of the British heirs to the Rothschild family. He's sort of an adventurer and environmentalist. I believe he's dating Angelina Jolie right now. So, he's doing okay. He wrote a book about the danger of climate change. And somehow in a series of events that I truly wish I'd been a fly on the wall for, he ended up doing an interview with InfoWars. And it's Alex Jones and David de Rothschild just kind of yelling at each other for 40 minutes. And David, I mean, to his credit, he doesn't lose his cool. He's very amused by the whole thing. You can almost sort of hear the smirk in his voice. And Alex is just getting angrier and angrier and angrier. And David's just not taking the bait. It's a very strange and very uncomfortable 40 or 45 minutes of grown men just yelling. It's fascinating.
Great. Well, Mike, we're going to take a break now. So everybody, the book is Jewish Space Lasers. There's links in the chat where if you're interested, you can pick up a copy. We're also going to ask all of your questions. So be sure to go to sitp.online/ask. And in the second half, we'll be putting all of your questions to Mike Rothschild. So we will be back at 8 p.m. with all of your questions. We'll speak to you then. Welcome back, everybody, to Skeptics in the Pub Online. I hope you're all relaxed, refreshed, and ready to put your questions to our speaker this evening, Mike Rothschild, who you can see on the screen here right now, who is raring to go and answer anything you want to put to him. So, Mike, let's put the first question to you. This is from As an Android on Slido here, who's asking, when it comes to Jewish Space Lasers, the title, which we haven't actually explained, was Marjorie Taylor Greene repeating an existing specific conspiracy theory with the space lasers thing, or was it one that she made up herself?
Well, she did. She definitely didn't make it up herself. The idea that there is a directed energy weapon, as they call it, that is being used to start forest fires for various evil purposes, that's been around for a while, and we sort of see another iteration of it every time there's a fire season. We saw it in 2018, 2020. We've seen it this year with the fires in Maui and then the fires in Canada. So that theory has been around for a while. And, the interesting thing about Marjorie Taylor Greene's post is, when she made that post, it was 2018. She was not a member of Congress yet. She was just a Georgia mom who had some questions. Mm-hmm. And of course, her questions revolved around, what was Rothschild Inc. doing to our forests? So she, comes up with this theory that Then, California Governor Jerry Brown and the husband of then Senator Dianne Feinstein and Pacific Gas and Electric were conspiring with this solar energy startup to beam energy from the sun to collection points on the earth. Oh, but they missed, and oh, isn't it convenient that that's exactly where California wanted to build its $70 billion high-speed rail boondoggle, and that a board member of Pacific Gas and Electric was also a vice president at Rothschild Inc. And oh, we know what that means. So, she never uses the word Jewish in the post. She never says Jewish space lasers. That really came in the reporting about the post when it was discovered a few years later. Nobody knew about it for the first couple of years, but that idea that the Rothschilds are using this technology to manipulate the weather and cause forest fires, that's definitely not something she invented off the top of her head.
Yeah, and I love the idea that they really just wanted to clear that land so they could build on it, and then the best, most seamless way to do that was to zap the land from space.
Right, the most subtle, non-visible ways to start a giant fire. It's one of those things that, again, if you think about it at all, it's so convoluted and so overly complicated that no one would do that. If you're going to clear the land, you'd do something else. But that's how these people think.
Yeah. So we got a few questions all about the situation that's in the Middle East right now. Garnet asks, with the events in Israel and Gaza these past couple of weeks, has there been a surge in anti-Jewish sentiment online, or is one expected?
Well, it's definitely happened. There's been an enormous surge in anti-Semitism, and also in the kind of lazy tropes that we've seen a lot of in the media over the past few generations. The easy conflating of Jews and Israel, the assumption that all American Jews or all Western Jews are secretly support Israel and aren't loyal to their country of origin, that all Jews agree with each other about everything. And I would say, if you think all Jews agree with each other about everything, just go out to dinner with 3 Jewish people, and very soon you are going to realize that Jews, are individuals just like everybody else. And plenty of American Jews do not support the Netanyahu government at all. And at the same time, I know a lot of Jewish people are very troubled by some of the rhetoric that's being used, by the idea that the Jewish state needs to be annihilated in order for there to be peace in the Middle East. I mean, I think that's a very anti-Semitic idea, and it doesn't revolve around Israel and Jews being the same thing, but it does acknowledge that there is a Jewish state, because for millennia, Jews have not been welcomed in a lot of the countries that they've lived in, and there's a lot of history there that is not easily boiled down to a pithy slogan.
Yeah, and it's that thing, I guess, of collective responsibility, which doesn't happen when there's an atrocity of Christians.
Right, exactly.
Happening to Christians, but I know here in the UK there were Jewish schools in London that were vandalised and targeted with paint. And I talked to a friend about it, and they made the point of the person who's vandalising that. What do they even think is the goal there? I mean, that 10-year-old going to school probably doesn't have a lot of impact on Netanyahu's whole domestic policy. And nobody's going to say, well, that swastika that I saw painted on a school door made some really good points. It's not persuading anybody.
Right. And what do my, German American relatives whose great grandfathers, what responsibility do they bear in the Holocaust? I mean, people just don't talk like that, except with Jews.
Yeah, absolutely. Serdar asks, in the Middle East, conspiracies around wealthy Jewish families often intertwined with Israel and Zionism. Is that the same with Rothschild conspiracy theories? What's their role in Israel and Zionist kind of ideas there?
Well, the Rothschilds are an interesting story in terms of Zionism, because you have, the Balfour Declaration was essentially, spearheaded by one of the Rothschilds. Theodore Herzl's letter was an address to the Rothschilds. But the Rothschilds were not united about Zionism. There were many members of the family who didn't see the need for a Jewish state, who felt like it would interfere too much with their own, business, who just didn't think it was a workable possibility. So even the Rothschilds really weren't united on the need or the feasibility for a Jewish state. So the idea that the Rothschilds and Zionism are really intertwined is much more complicated than that. The Rothschilds really are revered in Israel, but I think part of it is certainly Zionism, but I think also it's that the Rothschilds have really been an example to Jews around the world for the last 2 centuries of what is possible, of what Jewish accomplishment can really be. I talk about that in the book with this op-ed by Elie Wiesel in 1990, written around the time that the Rothschilds musical was revived on Broadway. He writes about how, growing up in the very poor, very isolated mountains of Romania, he knew the name Rothschild. It was a beacon of aspiration and of possibility and of hope. So I think for a lot of particularly Israeli Jews, that Rothschild name is still revered because of what it represents, not so much for the political connotations.
Yeah, and so that was their attitude to Israel. But in terms of conspiracy theory, the Nick G's asking, is there a lot of conspiracy that does explicitly try to tie the Rothschilds to Israel?
Oh, sure. Oh, absolutely. You have the same tropes, really. The idea that the Rothschilds are sort of the puppet masters and controlling everything. There's a Syrian miniseries that I write about in the book. It's essentially translated as the diaspora. And one of these, it's completely adapted from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And one of these scenes is this very stereotypical version of Mayor Amschel Rothschild on his deathbed, commanding his sons to go out into the world and enslave the Christians and the Muslims. And it's the same stuff, but it's being broadcast to countries where Jews have like a 0% favorability rating. So it finds a much more willing audience in a lot of these countries.
Yeah, and that was something that I thought was really fascinating from the book. You pointed out that the protocols have been translated into Arabic more than pretty much any other language. It's really sort of taken hold in those parts of the world.
Yeah, the protocols are hugely, hugely popular in the Arabic world.
Yeah, and looking at these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories from around the world, we've touched on the Middle East. What about other parts of the world where Jewish people are less likely to have set up communities there? Do they still have the same elements of these types of ideas, these types of conspiracy theories?
Oh, absolutely. There are anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in countries that have no real Jewish population. In the book, I write about the anti-Semitism and sort of weird Jewish fetishizing in Japan in the 70s. You had these best-selling books about how if you can understand Judea, you can understand Japan and all of these other things. And in China, there was a very, very popular series of books called Currency Wars. The first one that came out, I think I want to say it was 2009, that was talking about the Asian financial crisis of a couple of years earlier and blaming it on the Rothschilds. Talking about how the Rothschilds own trillions of dollars in wealth and control the destiny of nations. It's the same thing that you would see in anti-Federal Reserve books of the 1950s and 60s in the US. It's just sort of repurposed for a different audience.
There's an anonymous question here asking, of all the crazy anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that you've come across in your research in this area, what's the craziest or the most unusual sort of details that you've discovered?
I really enjoy maybe isn't the right word, but writing about the ravings of this exiled Russian count named Arthur Cherep-Spritovich. He was this monarchist who fled Russia during the revolution, and he went to Staten Island, and he wanted to start a pan-Slavic nation through the United Gentiles League. And this guy wrote a book called The Secret World Governments in the mid-20s that really actually kind of is a harbinger for a lot of the popularity of the conspiracy theories that would grow in the 30s and 40s. The Jews are world dominators, and the Rothschilds control hundreds of billions of dollars and are pitting all of the nations against each other. This guy eventually concocted this theory that Benjamin Disraeli met with two of the Rothschild heirs at a wedding in the 1850s and hatched a plot to use slavery as an excuse to divide the United States, and that one Rothschild could get the North and one Rothschild would get the South. And it has these sort of very sort of cinematic touches of these speeches and secret invasions and like all this crap. And I'd never heard of this guy. His writing really has no real imprint in the West, but I think you see the seeds of a lot of this stuff getting planted in his writing that you would later find would become very popular in stuff like David Icke and Secrets of the Federal Reserve and stuff like that.
You spend a lot of time looking at this stuff, and you say there you find it interesting, although interesting isn't quite the word.
Yeah.
How do you stay grounded when you look through all this stuff, especially when they're talking about something that is, a part of your identity? It's an existential threat to, and has been in the past, to your ancestors. How do you find yourself not despairing and getting lost in it?
Yeah. It's easier sometimes than others. Right now, it's particularly difficult. But with a lot of this writing, it's really bad. A lot of this stuff is just really, really poorly written
Hmm.
and very difficult to read. So it's almost hard to get offended by it because it's so sloppy and so recycling the same ideas over and over again. And if you've seen it once, you've kind of seen it a bunch of times. Um, you really treat it as a job. And
Hmm.
of course, if you're writing a book and somebody's contracted with you to do this, it is a job. You log in at the beginning of the day, you do your work, you try to leave it there when you're done with it. I would try to really be done when I was done with it, and say, okay, I'll come back to it the next day. And you find this with a lot of current events, these mass shootings and these horrible things going on. A lot of this stuff breaks at night, and I'm not going to spend all night up on Twitter doom scrolling and trying to figure out what my angle is on it. There are enough people now covering this that I feel like people can take a break, and it will be written about. It will not disappear.
Hmm.
The mental health of disinformation journalists and writers covering misinformation, it's very pressing, and it's something we talk about a lot in the conversations that I have with other people on this. And everybody has coping mechanisms, usually that involve things that have nothing to do with any of this work. I also, I have a family and I have young
Hmm.
kids, so I can't get too engrossed in what's going on in the rest of the world because my kids need stuff, and of course, my kids don't care about any of this stuff at all, which is the way it should be. And so I find that having a family, having hobbies, things that are not involving this kind of work, really do help keep me on the right track and not going down the rabbit hole myself.
Yeah, I think that sounds enormously healthy. I had to set myself a rule of no looking at Telegram before I get out of bed because I would
There
find
you
that was
go.
the
There you
first
go.
thing I was
No,
doing. It's,
no conspiracy theories in bed.
yeah, exactly.
Have to have that first cup of coffee.
So we have another question here from Nick G, who asks, how much do you think this movement of people from secular conspiracy theories into anti-Semitism versus anti-Semitic conspiracies sort of moving into the wider conspiracy theory landscape?
Oh, that's a great question. With a lot of the earliest Rothschild conspiracy theories, it was much more about wealth. That first generation of really socialist anti-Rothschild conspiracies was very much about economic concentration and not so much about religion. But I find that the people who spread anti-Semitic conspiracy theories while claiming they're not anti-Semitic, it's just about economic issues, they are often extremely anti-Semitic. They're very much against the Jewish religion in general. They don't want to be thought of as anti-Semitic. They want to be
Hmm.
thought of as sort of trying to correct economic imbalances and things like that. But ultimately, it really does boil down to very kind of classic evangelical tropes. And of course, anti-Semitism, anti-Rothschild theories, QAnon, hugely popular in the evangelical community. There were real issues of pastors who really had to deal with these sort of outbreaks of conspiracy belief in their churches because these things all fit together so well.
Yeah, and you see that also with beliefs like flat Earth and
Mm,
even moon landing denial.
yeah,
When I spent time around flat Earth communities, I was always shocked at how much they would pin things back to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories,
yeah.
and I always referred to this as with a friend of mine who writes in these areas quite a lot as kind of the reverse Godwin law. Godwin's law of the
Mm,
internet. The longer an
yeah,
argument goes on, eventually someone invokes the Nazis. The reverse
yeah.
Godwin is the longer a conspiracy theory exists, eventually it will become anti-Semitic because
I like that. Yeah,
you're looking for answers as to who's hiding the truth about the flat Earth or the moon landing, and
right,
eventually you find who they are because there's
right.
centuries of people filling that answer in.
Yeah, that's
Let's see. We
exactly
have another question here. This anonymous question. Have you done your own family tree, and how
it.
far are you from being a baron?
Well, I'm very far from being a baron. I'm probably closer to a red baron frozen pizza than I am to a being an actual baron. But when I started doing this, my dad sent me a family genealogy, and somebody had one of my great uncles, who I never met, hired a genealogist to basically put the whole family tree together. And one of the things that's written about in this book is the desire to find out if we were at all related to the Frankfurt Rothschilds, and we're not at all. My father's family came from Nordstetten, which was a village that's something like 250 miles northeast of Frankfurt. There's no real reason why they ever would have crossed paths. But that was a real desire to find out, kind of, were we connected? Was there any linkage to this famous name that had this aura of wealth and success to it? And of course, my father's family, a lot of them emigrated to the Midwest in the United States. So they went to Chicago, they went to Kansas City, they went to Davenport, Iowa, and they were very successful there. So there are a number of German Jewish families who have this last name, who've had success. They just haven't had these sort of like billionaire palaces, plot of land the size of Manhattan kind of success that those Rothschilds have had.
Yeah. Well, Nick, you asked a question I think fits in quite well with that. Have you ever felt that yourself or your family been in danger as a result of the conspiracies that are tied to the Rothschild family because of your name happening to be the same?
I've never felt in danger. I've definitely worked very hard to scrub information about me from the internet, which is a good practice anyway. But I've never felt in particular like there was any danger of the last name imperiling me. Mostly what it is sort of like comments, which is great now that I have a book about this out. But, I just finished a book tour a few weeks ago, and pretty much every hotel I checked into, I would get some comment on like, "Oh, Rothschild." And I would say, "Oh, well, I actually have a book that just came out about it." And sometimes people would be really interested in it. I had one guy in DC, I was talking about the book, and he said, "Oh, I've got a book for you that I think you should read. I really recommend this." And he writes the title down on a piece of paper. I didn't have a chance to read it until I got up to my room. It was The Creature from Jekyll Island, the classic G. Edward Griffin conspiracy theory book that's extremely anti-Semitic. Yikes. And also ripped off from the Eustace Mullins book, Secrets of the Federal Reserve, which was, sponsored by Ezra Pound. I was like, I'm not going to say anything to the guy, but it's just funny how, like, you talk about this stuff and people's true colors start to come out. But definitely you get comments. My wife was traveling in Dallas a while back, and she was at the TSA check-in. She's on Southwest Airlines, a very budget airline, and the TSA agent was like, "Oh, Rothschild, are you part of the family?" She's like, "No, I'm in my Group B boarding on Southwest Airlines, hoping that I don't get squeezed into a middle seat." She's like, "Oh, good. I'm glad you're not related, because I've heard that they drink baby blood." And you're like, "What do you say?" She was like, "Oh, okay," and just very quickly walks away. But it's like, yeah, people say stuff. People have just heard stuff. And I'm hoping that with this book, I can rebalance the scales a little bit of sanity and skepticism, rather than wild fish stories that get passed around the internet.
Yeah. So you've never been tempted to try and use the surname to get into like Mar-a-Lago?
I have not. Others have, and it's gone very well for them until it hasn't. But the name really has an aura to it. It has a mystique. People know that name is connected to money, and it's really easy to pull people in with it.
So there's a question here from Andrew, who asks, sort of more generally, more broadly, why are people so attracted to conspiracy theories like this? Is it too simplistic to say that some people's everyday lives are just too boring otherwise? So this kind of adds spice and excitement.
I think that's a big part of it. I think a lot of the connection and attraction of these kind of global cabal conspiracy theories is that it gives you something to focus on that is not just your sort of boring everyday work and family life. It's, with something like QAnon, it's exciting to be part of something like this. With something like the Rothschilds, you feel like you're untangling these vast historical plots and conspiracy theories. It offers an explanation. It offers why things are the way they are, and why is finance so complicated? Why can't I get ahead? Why do the rich people get to do whatever they want? Well, it's the Jews, it's the Rothschilds, it's the cabal. And, a lot of times there is a cabal of rich people who are in charge of things. It's just like, it's the banks, and it's the billionaires, and it's the tech bros. It's not the Jews. It's not the Rothschilds. It's like the people who are, making it impossible for you to get a raise. That's the cabal that's in charge of things, and they don't make any. They don't hide at all.
Yeah, and it's that thing, I guess, that the real forces that control our lives are these big overarching things, but they're normally incredibly boring, incredibly mundane, incredibly
Right.
bureaucratic, and
Yeah.
therefore quite hard to fight. Whereas
Right.
you can if you can put a name on an enemy, you can rise up against them, and those kinds of things, really.
Yeah.
Igor asked a question kind of around that, I guess. Why do the stories always have to end up having these kind of weird details? Is it because of our love of storytelling that helps them spread, or is these strange details as an essential part of conspiracy theories generally?
They're really an essential part, and the more detailed and the weirder a conspiracy theory is, the more durable it's going to be. You have somebody like David Icke writes these books that are like 900 pages long, and he puts one out every year, and they're always the same book. They never tell any kind of different story. They're just the same story told with more detail, more machinations, more evil plotting. The more detail you add to something like this, the more truthful it sounds. And it really helps if there is a grain of truth in some of the stories. That grain of truth then just gets loaded down with all of these irrelevant, unprovable, unnecessary details, but that's what gives it the veracity.
Yeah, I just had to look while you were talking there. I have got a copy of one of David Icke's books. If any of the viewers at home haven't seen, they really are incredibly thick, incredibly dense, thousands of pages.
They are like, I mean, you could like build a house out of some of these books. And it's always the same thing. It's just the same book, except it's just longer.
Yeah, and with more memes, more up-to-date memes.
More memes,
pasted into it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Nick, you asked a question here when it comes to like these strange kind of conspiracy theories. Have you ever seen any overlap in the Rothschild conspiracy theories and the Nizara or Jizara theories? And do you think there's any theories around Rothschild money being impacted in any way by this reset? You may need to explain what Nizara and Jizara are for our viewers.
Yes. So Nizara or Jizara, they're the same thing. Nizara is basically a conspiracy theory that started in about the late 90s, that there was a secret law that was passed by the US government that would essentially void all debt, bring us back to the gold standard, completely revolutionize the economic system, and make people who had gotten access to these secret prosperity packets essentially into instant millionaires. And it was sort of a classic grift. You had Nizara gurus who had the secret information, and you would send them money and they would send you newsletters or give you, phone blasts or fax blasts with how Nizara was about to come true. So this theory has been going on for decades. It's gotten wrapped up into the Iraqi dinar scam, which is another one of those classic Ponzi schemes, selling you this pretty much worthless currency on the hope that it's going to revalue and make you a millionaire. There was talk of Nizara even a couple years ago when President Biden passed the CARES Act, that this was going to be the release of the Nizara prosperity packets. And as part of this, there's going to be a global currency reset that's going to put all of the money of the world on a level playing field. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's like pie in the sky economics. It's not how any of this works. I've never seen specifically the Rothschilds kind of linked to Nizara, but I think the Rothschilds are seen as like one of the forces that's holding Nizara back. Like there's this constant battle between the white hats and the black hats, and the black hats used 9/11 to destroy all of the paperwork for Nizara, and there's this secret war, and there's angels and aliens and like astral planes and galactic federations, and it's just like crazy stuff. But I think the Rothschilds are lumped in with the sort of the black hats who would lose all of their power if suddenly everyone in the world were wealthy. Well, if everyone in the world were wealthy, money wouldn't mean anything. So, they would still be really powerful because they have all these other resources. So, yeah, I think the Rothschilds are seen as some of the dark forces who don't want you to be rich through Nizara.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I know that there's it all got wrapped up into QAnon and also the cryptocurrency kind of boom. I remember I went to a QAnon meeting in Birmingham put on by Charlie Ward, whose name you probably know as a QAnon influencer here in the UK.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
his whole grift on this was Jazara is definitely coming. I'm in contact with the white hats who are doing this, and they've assured me that when they do the reset, they'll need to move on to a cryptocurrency in the meantime. And they're moving on to my cryptocurrency. So if you just buy
Unbelievable.
my own cryptocurrency, and a lot of people will believe it.
Unbelievable.
Let's see. So Serdar's got another question here. Are today's conspiracy theories shifting focus from specific families like the Rothschilds to be more vague, unnamed entities like the cabal or globalists, and these kind of terms that can be shifted around a little?
I think they go hand in hand. I think you've always had these sort of evil organizations, the Freemasons, the Catholics, the Illuminati, the Hidden Hand, the Committee of 300. There's always going to be a sort of secret society, the Club of the Isles, the Insiders, all these different groups. And they're sort of think tanks, the Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, Bilderberg Group. But at the end of the day, somebody has to be sort of funding these things. Somebody has to be sort of the string pullers of the string pullers. So again, you come back to the Rothschilds and the very top of the pyramid, these families that run the Illuminati. They're doing everything through all of these groups that then filters down to the masses. But at the very, very top of the pyramid is always going to be somebody like the Rothschilds, like the Warburgs, like Soros now. They go hand in hand together, and you can add any level of detail that you want to them.
Yeah, I mean they need a name, otherwise that you can't see who you're trying to.
Right, you have to name the enemy. You have
absolutely.
to give them a designation.
Okay, so we've got two more questions left. They're both from Igor, who I think I've not actually asked many of Igor's questions. Normally, Igor dominates the Q&A, so maybe I'm redressing the balance somewhat. But we're going to give him the last two questions. So the first of his questions is, at some point, even the worst parts of the conspiracy theory community should theoretically grow tired of anti-Semitism. Do you think that will happen? And if so, who do you think will become the next universal bogeyman?
Well, it definitely cycles up and down. There are societal sort of spasms of anti-Semitism. Certainly, we're having one now. We certainly had one in the 1920s and 30s and the 1890s and on and on. So there are times when another outgroup becomes the scapegoat for society, usually because of some sort of political event. Certainly after 9/11, Islamophobia became, I think, much more of a going concern than anti-Semitism. I think in the early days of COVID, anti-Asian sentiment became the same thing. But it definitely comes back to the Jews. There's always some sort of Jewish involvement. There's the dancing Israelis on 9/11. There's the Rothschilds secretly invented COVID. So society definitely moves towards other groups, but they never completely move away from Jews.
Yeah, and I guess we also see a multi-layered thing. So when it's immigration, well, there's so many people of color coming into the country, but they're being brought here by the Jews. So it's like a two-layered thing. And similar with, you see the pink panic, the trans panic, these are all being spread by the Jews in order to weaken the white race and various things like that. So even behind one panic, there's a second panic, I guess. And the last question from Igor here is, do you know who or what you're going to be investigating next? What's the plan after this?
Well, I'm definitely working on developing Jewish space lasers as a documentary. I feel like there is a whole audience out there that will appreciate this material in a more cinematic way, and also talking about kind of Jewish world domination tropes in general and how they play into these conspiracy theories. So that's the thing I'm working on right now, and hopefully we'll have some good news about that soon.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we'll certainly look out for that. Mike, thanks so much for this. I've really enjoyed this. I'm sure all of the viewers have too. The book is Jewish Space Lasers. There's a link in the chat if you want to go out and buy that. If you've really enjoyed this conversation as much as I have, it will be up on YouTube if you want to watch it back, as will be all of the other events that we put on going back years now. So there's lots and lots of skeptical goodness on our YouTube channel, which again, you can find in the chat. I'm not going to tell you the YouTube channel. It's right there in the chat, I'm sure. If you want to hang around, people, feel free to hang around and join the the Zoom pub that will be opening shortly, the Lock-In's Razor, where people can hang around, have a drink, have a chat to everybody, and have fun. If not, we will see you next month for Stephen Colgan asking, do we need another witchcraft? That's the 23rd of November. We'll see you then. And thanks once again to Mike Rothschild.
Thank you.